I was sitting in a small cafe on the corner of the street, and before I could even lift my cup to my lips, the phone in my bag vibrated. Julie's name appeared on the screen. I thought she was calling to ask which area needed cleaning next, but the moment I picked up, I heard quick, shaky breaths. Very soft, like she was trying not to make a sound. Miss Linda!" Julie's voice trembled so much it nearly broke. There's a woman standing on the second floor." I froze. "Julie, what do you mean? My house is locked." She's looking toward the stairs. White dress. Messy hair. She went into the last room at the end of the hall. "Miss Linda, I'm scared." Right then, I heard a crack, wood creaking. Then a very soft footstep dragging slightly, echoing through the phone. I shot up from my seat. My heart slammed against my chest. "Julie, get out of the house right now. Don't look back. Go outside and lock the door." Static crackled through the phone, as if someone were touching the line. Then silence. I grabbed my bag, practically running out of the cafe. My steps were so fast I could barely breathe. I called again. Julie picked up, but her voice was broken, as if she was hiding behind something. "Miss Linda." I saw her clearly, thin, hair sticking to her cheeks. She tilted her head like she was listening to my footsteps. I heard Julie choke on a sob. My phone. Someone just touched my shoulder. Then the line cut completely. I almost screamed inside the car. The creaking, the breathing, the static, all of it spun inside my head. Before I continue the rest of the story, if you're listening with me right now, hit subscribe and leave a greeting from wherever you're watching. Today's story isn't just a chilling mystery. It's also a reminder about family, the thread that connects us all. That morning was so peaceful. I never imagined it would become the beginning of such a terrifying day. I stood in the living room with a soft cloth in my hand, slowly wiping each glass pane. The sun had just come out, not yet warm enough to clear all the moisture clinging to the door. Every rainy season, the house seemed heavier, with the old stone walls absorbing moisture and the wooden stairs creaking and making strange sounds. The house was over 70 years old. My husband and I had lived here for more than 30 years, familiar with the sound of wooden doors closing, the dim light in the second-floor hallway, and the dark corners. Even the yellow bulbs couldn't fully reach. Sometimes I thought it was this very oldness that made me love the house. It gave me a sense of belonging, even if the nights felt a little cold. When I finished the last glass pane, I paused, staring at my reflection. My face had more wrinkles now, but the eyes were still the eyes of someone who carried many memories. Suddenly, I thought of Rosa, just for a moment. A flash of her standing in the yard, hair tied high, notebook in hand, smiling from ear to ear. Just thinking of her made my chest tighten. 20 years had passed, yet every memory of her still felt like yesterday. Right then, my phone rang. The caller surprised me. Anne. We'd grown up together, close like sisters, but for years we'd barely exchanged more than holiday greetings. I answered, and Anne's voice was just as warm and cheerful as before. "Linda, I'm in town for a day. Come to the garden behind the cafe, will you? I'm sitting here. Weather's lovely." I glanced around the messy house. My plan was to finish cleaning the entire ground floor before noon, but hearing Anne's voice lifted something in me. I hadn't spoken to anyone besides Mark for a long time, and the loneliness of retirement sometimes made me afraid of my own thoughts. I thought of Julie, quick, careful, always eager to help. When she agreed to come clean this morning, she insisted, "Don't worry, ma'am, I can handle everything." So I took off my apron, placed the cloth in the basin, and grabbed my coat. I paused at the doorway, gazing up at the wooden stairs that led to the second floor. I hadn't gone up there in a long time. Mark always said, "I'll take care of that area. It's too dangerous. You could slip." I'd gotten so used to his warning that I never questioned it. I locked the door, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The wet stone pavement reflected a thin layer of sunlight. I had no idea that choosing to leave the house that morning would bring me closer to a truth hidden for nearly 3 decades. Julie arrived at my house about 10 minutes earlier than planned. She stood tucked under the porch, hands clasped together as if trying to keep warm in the damp morning. She was 22, small, soft-spoken, and polite. I'd known her for a few years, ever since many families in the neighborhood started hiring her for regular cleaning. Everyone praised her. She was hardworking, quiet, and observant. When I opened the door, she smiled. Her smile always made people feel at ease, as if everything was under control. "I'm a bit early, ma'am. I didn't want you to wait," she said. "That's all right, dear. I was just about to make some tea." I let Julie inside. She glanced around, not with nosiness, but like she was mapping out the space, figuring out where to start. She strolled, lowering her head a little as she examined the curtains, the door frames, then looked toward the stairs leading to the second floor. "Your house is lovely, but a bit dark," she murmured. "Old houses like this often make small sounds in the afternoon. I'm used to it." Julie wasn't boasting. It was simply how she was. She once told me that some old houses had noises their owners ignored, but she heard them clearly. She said she could feel how a house breathes. It sounded strange, but it fit her sensitive nature. I handed her a spare key. She took it with both hands, nodding carefully, as if accepting a serious responsibility. "Please go ahead with your plans, ma'am. I'll clean the ground floor first, then the second one if there's time." I hesitated. The second floor. "Be careful, dear. The wooden stairs are old. Step too hard and they creak. You might slip. My husband always tells me not to go up there alone." Julie looked at me, frowning slightly, as though trying to understand something more. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be careful. Old houses always have unpredictable corners." Her words tugged at something in me, but I didn't dwell on it. Ever since Mark told me not to go upstairs alone, I had rarely gone. He always said the clutter was dangerous, and I believed him. Julie set down her tool bag, tied her hair, and started working immediately. I watched for a moment. She wiped each edge of the cabinets and rearranged the picture frames, always being gentle and patient. I could trust her. "That's wonderful. Help me with this today. I'm meeting a friend." Julie looked up and smiled. "Don't worry about a thing, ma'am. I'm comfortable here." I nodded, took my coat, and stepped out. The door closed behind me. I didn't know that just a few hours later, Julie would be the one to open the door, leading me to the truth I had unknowingly walked away from for 20 years. I had just sat down in the garden behind the cafe with Anne when my phone vibrated. I thought Julie was calling to ask where to put the cleaning supplies or to request more glass cleaner. But the moment I lifted the phone to my ear, I heard something that made my whole body go cold. "Ms. Linda." Julie's voice trembled so much I had to press the phone tightly to my ear to hear her. She was breathing hard, each breath catching in her throat. "What's wrong, dear?" I asked, unease rising in my chest. A short silence. Then Julie whispered, "There's a woman standing on your second floor." I stopped breathing. The cafe around me fell silent in my ears, no matter how many people were talking. Julie continued, her voice barely holding steady. "She's really thin, long hair, messy, sticking to her cheeks. Miss Linda, I had just walked up a few steps when I saw her silhouette at the end of the hallway. She didn't say anything, just turned her head and looked at me." I heard Julie let out a small sob. "Then she walked very slowly, went into the last room, the one whose door was slightly open earlier." My hands began to shake. I stood up too fast, the chair tipping to one side. Anne looked at me, startled, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. Through the phone, I heard Julie stepping backward, the wooden floor creaking under her. "Julie, get out of the house right now, do you understand?" I almost shouted. "Miss Linda, I'm scared. There's a sound, like someone is standing right behind me." Her voice tightened as if someone was squeezing her throat. Then a faint thud, like something tapping the phone. "Julie, Julie," the line crackled for a few seconds, then went dead. I practically threw the phone into my bag and rushed out of the cafe. Cold air slapped my face as I ran so fast I could barely keep my balance. My legs faltered, but I didn't stop. All I could picture was the woman Julie described, thin, messy hair, motionless at the end of the hallway. I ran while dialing the police. My voice shook as I spoke. "My name is Linda. There's an intruder in my house. The girl helping me saw a woman on the second floor. Please come immediately." The officer tried to calm me, but my heart pounded so hard my hands lost feeling around the phone. The road home suddenly felt longer than ever. I could only run, gasping for air, each step sinking deeper into rising fear. When I turned onto my street, I saw the police car just arriving. Its flashing lights reflected off the old windows of the houses. I ran straight to my door, calling Julie's name, trying to hold myself together. I never imagined that this call was only the beginning of a truth far more horrifying. When I reached the door, the police were already there. Two officers, one older with a stern face and the other younger, entered as soon as I unlocked it. Julie was crouched on the doorstep, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes were red, her face pale as if she had witnessed something unbearable. I rushed to her. "Are you hurt? Did anything happen to you?" Julie shook her head, but her hands trembled nonstop. She could only manage one short sentence, her voice barely audible. I really saw her. She was standing there. I gently held her hand, trying to calm her, then stepped aside for the officers. They searched the house from the first floor to the second. Every window checked. Every corner, every closet, under every bed opened. I waited in the living room, heart heavy, hoping they would find something, anything to prove Julie hadn't imagined it. But about 20 minutes later, the older officer came down the stairs, shaking his head. "There's no one in the house, no signs of forced entry. The windows and back door are all locked from the inside." My stomach twisted. Julie looked up at them, her eyes filled with desperation. "I'm not lying. I saw her clearly." The younger officer softened his voice. "It's all right. You might have been startled by a shadow or a reflection. Old houses like this can play tricks on the eyes." Julie bowed her head, tears dripping onto her hands. I knew she wasn't lying. She wasn't the type to imagine things out of nowhere. But the police had found nothing, and I had no evidence to offer. They filed a report, told me to lock the doors carefully, and left. I stood at the entrance watching the red and blue lights fade away. Just then, a car pulled into our driveway. My husband, Mark, got out. He looked exhausted, but when he saw the police car leaving, he frowned. "What happened?" I told him everything, from Julie's call to the description of the woman on the second floor. After hearing it all, Mark chuckled softly. That smile unsettled me, though I didn't know why. "You really believe that? This house is old, shadows everywhere. The girl must have been tired and imagined it." He patted Julie on the shoulder as if comforting her, but Julie flinched, stepping back, eyes wary. She didn't trust his reaction, and neither did I. As he walked inside, I caught him glancing up at the ceiling for just a split second, very quick, but unmistakable. It wasn't the look of a man hearing nonsense. It was the look of someone checking to see if something had been noticed. I followed him in, my chest tightening. I tried to reassure myself that I was overthinking, but whenever I remembered Julie's trembling voice, the unease tightened around my ribs again. I didn't know the story had only just begun, and the most frightening part was the first person to see the truth wasn't me, but a young girl barely old enough to handle the terror she couldn't explain. In the days that followed, my house felt different. Not in a way that showed something obviously wrong, but every slight sound, every change in my routine started drawing my attention. At first, I thought I was being overly sensitive after what happened with Julie, but the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer the signs became. On the first night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint scraping of a chair upstairs. The sound was slow, steady, like someone dragging an old wooden chair from one corner to another. I lay still, listening. Mark had fallen asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, breathing heavily and evenly. There were only the two of us in the house. No one could possibly be walking around in the attic near midnight. A moment later, I heard footsteps, very soft, not the scurrying of mice or a draft shifting the floorboards. These steps were steady, weighted, coming from directly above our bedroom ceiling. I tried telling myself old houses creak unpredictably. Still, those footsteps didn't resemble anything I'd heard in the 30 years I'd lived here. On the second night, I woke to a faint cough. It was close enough that I shot upright, thinking Mark had choked on water, but he was sound asleep. The sound had come from upstairs, a clear cough. Human. Unmistakably human, not an object falling or wind moving through a vent. I lay in the darkness, heart pounding. Julie's trembling voice echoed so vividly in my mind. That girl hadn't imagined the woman. I knew it. By the following week, small things around the house chilled me more than the noises ever did. One morning, I opened the refrigerator to take out the leftover slice of ham, but half of it was gone. Mark never touched cold cuts. I knew that. I sighed, convincing myself I must have used it for dinner and forgotten. I had no proof to suspect anything else. But the second time I couldn't find the portion I had placed in a separate container, I knew I wasn't mistaken. I'd never forgotten details like that. Still, what frightened me most happened one evening when Mark and I got home late. I went straight to the bathroom on the second floor to wash my face, and my foot touched cold, wet tiles. The water streaks were fresh, glistening under the light. The sides of the bathtub still had droplets running down them. Someone had clearly bathed not long ago. "Mark, come up here," I called, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped in, looked at the floor, then shrugged. "Maybe the pipes leaked. I'll check it in the morning." Mark always had a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe him, but my eyes were drawn to the sink. On it was a long silver strand of hair, thin, brittle, like that of an older adult. I froze. I couldn't explain that hair. It wasn't mine. It definitely wasn't Mark's. And the moment I saw it, I felt, deep in my bones, that something had existed in this house long before Julie accidentally saw it. One afternoon, while Mark was out meeting his editor, I decided to clean his study. It was the room he spent the most time in. Ever since I retired, I rarely entered it, but everything that had happened lately made me want to check every corner of the house. I started at his desk. On it were stacks of manuscripts, scribbled notes, and a thin layer of dust at the edges. I gathered the papers to wipe down the surface. As I lifted a hefty stack, my hand slipped slightly and the pile toppled onto the floor. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the room, it startled me. I bent down to pick them up. As I reached deeper under the desk, my fingers brushed against the edge of a small drawer, hidden near the inner corner. It hadn't been opened in years. Its edges were stiff and dry. I tugged gently. It didn't budge. When I applied a bit more force, it suddenly snapped open with a dry click. Inside was just one item, a small old leather notebook, dark brown, its edges worn. I picked it up. It felt cool to the touch. Clearly, it had been there for a long time. I opened the first page and froze. The handwriting, soft, slightly slanted, perfectly rounded, was so familiar it tightened my chest. I had seen that handwriting throughout my youth, the handwriting of someone who vanished almost 30 years ago. Rosa. I placed my hand on the page. Breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe it, but every curve of the letters, the way she looped her R, the way she ended her Y, precisely the same. There was no mistake. I turned a few more pages. Inside were character notes, scene descriptions, and bits of dialogue. Every page felt alive, written with passion and creative hunger, so unlike the cold typed drafts Mark produced on his computer. I flipped to a page in the middle. As I read a few lines, my heartbeat slowed. The content, I knew it. Not because it was familiar, because it was identical. It was the opening chapter of the novel that made Mark famous. I continued comparing it in my mind. The plot, the characters, the dialogues. Everything was the same, not inspired by, not similar idea. The same down to the small details. So identical I could almost hear Mark's proud voice explaining how he had created it himself. I sat down, the notebook on my lap. A coldness crept from my neck down my spine. Rosa had dreamed of becoming a writer. Her handwriting once overflowed with excitement. So why was her notebook in my husband's study? And why had its contents become his work? Questions swirled in my mind. For the first time, I felt the signs around the house weren't simple at all. Something had been hidden, not for a year or two, but for an entire chapter of my life that I thought had been peaceful. I placed the notebook back into the drawer, my hands still trembling. I knew I had just touched the first thread of the truth. 2 days after I found the notebook, Mark left early in the morning. I stayed home alone, trying to cook lunch, to quiet the thoughts spinning in my head. While I was cleaning the kitchen, there was a knock on the door. I opened it and saw Mr. Dalton, Mark's longtime editor, standing on the porch. Mr. Dalton was an older man, somewhat thin, and always wore silver-rimmed glasses. When he saw me, he gave a polite smile, but his expression held a trace of unease. "Hello, Linda," he said. "I came looking for Mark. He didn't show up for our meeting today." I invited him into the living room. He sat down, placed his document bag beside him, and exhaled lightly as if weighing something. "Mark has been avoiding us lately," he said. "His new manuscript is a month overdue. I've called many times, but he keeps saying it's not finished." I stayed quiet for a moment, trying to stay composed. He continued, "You know, Mark's writing style has always been inconsistent. Sometimes very smooth, sometimes completely different. I used to think he had someone helping him write." He said it gently, but it was enough for me to sense his suspicion. I forced a smile to avoid responding. As he stood up to leave, he paused, glanced at the ceiling, and said softly, "Owner, and for the past few weeks, whenever I walk past your house at night, I've noticed the attic light is on, usually quite late. Do you go up there to read or look for things?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I don't turn on the attic light," I admitted. Mr. Dalton's eyes flickered with surprise. "I assumed you and Mark worked up there at night. Well, perhaps I was mistaken. Please remind him to contact me." He said goodbye and left, leaving a strange, heavy silence in his wake. I hadn't even regained my composure when I heard the neighbor's fence rattle slightly. Mr. Harris, the man who had lived beside us for over 20 years, leaned over with his watering hose still in hand. "Linda, I overheard your conversation. Let me ask, has anyone been upstairs in your house lately?" I turned to him, puzzled. "No." "Why?" He hesitated before speaking honestly. "There were a few nights I couldn't sleep and I heard very slow footsteps, like an older person walking around. At first I thought it was you or Mark, but those footsteps, they were light and steady, like someone familiar with that wooden floor." Heat rose in my chest before draining away entirely. Everything he described matched what I had been hearing for weeks. Concern shadowed Mr. Harris's face. "I don't mean to frighten you, but the house has felt strange lately. If you want, I can come check upstairs one night." I thanked him, though my voice trembled. He returned to watering his plants, while I stood frozen on the porch, feeling as though someone was watching from above. For the first time, I knew I wasn't mistaken. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the old house. Someone, or something, was living on the second floor, and it had been there for a very long time. That night, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The words of Mr. Dalton and Mr. Harris kept replaying in my mind, together with the notebook written in Rosa's handwriting. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Something inside me pushed me to finally see what was happening in my own home. I walked to the shed behind the garden and took out the old folding ladder. I hadn't used it in years. When I pulled it out, dust filled the air and I had to cover my mouth. The night was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I placed the ladder directly under the attic hatch in the hallway on the second floor. The hallway light was dim, barely enough, but I forced myself to stay calm. When my hand touched the metal latch, a chill ran down my spine. The latch was rusty. I had to use quite a bit of strength before it finally released with a dry, sharp click, louder than I expected. I gripped the wooden panel and pushed it open. A wave of warm air rushed down at me immediately. It smelled of old paper, dampness, and something else, something like the faint scent of a human presence. I stood still for a few seconds, letting myself adjust, then turned on my phone's flashlight. The weak beam illuminated the attic. Dust floated in the air. Old cardboard boxes, furniture draped in cloth, tangled cables, and an old curtain I thought I had thrown away. But none of those things drew my attention. In the farthest corner, the one that should have been the darkest, there was a soft yellow glow. A small oil lamp was burning, its flame quivering. In front of a low wooden table sat a broken chair, one leg supported by a stack of books. The table was neatly arranged with papers, pens, and several unfinished manuscript pages. And not just that. There was a thin mattress laid out on the floor, a blanket beside it, a wash basin, empty food cans, a water bottle. Everything indicated that someone had been living here for a very long time. I moved the flashlight to the left and froze. Someone was sitting there, slightly hunched, with long silver hair falling over their shoulders. The figure was skinny, hands resting on the table, trembling faintly. When they heard me step onto the ladder, they flinched and turned. I saw the face. I hadn't seen that face in nearly 30 years, but it took only a second to recognize it. "Rosa?" I whispered, almost too softly for myself to hear. My sister turned fully toward me. Her eyes were deep, filled with fear, sadness, and an apology all at once. She lifted her head slightly, then immediately shielded her eyes from the flashlight, unaccustomed to harsh light after so long. My heart nearly stopped. I climbed up on trembling legs and moved toward her. She didn't back away. She simply stayed still, like someone long accustomed to being untouched. "It's me. It's Linda," I said, my voice breaking. Rosa slowly opened her eyes. The moment our eyes met, I felt our childhood, our memories, our pain, all rushing back at once. I knelt beside her. She lifted a fragile hand toward mine, as if to confirm I was real. I wrapped my arms around her. She was so light, I had to hold her firmly so she wouldn't fall. In the shadows of that attic, only one thought filled my mind. My sister had never left our family. On the contrary, she had been living just above me for almost 30 years. I helped Rosa down the stairs. Every step she took was slow and unsteady, like someone who hadn't been out in the world for a very long time. I sat her on the sofa and wrapped a thin blanket around her. She quietly looked around, her eyes cloudy, as if unaccustomed to brightness. After a while, once her breathing steadied, Rosa gripped my hand. Her voice was hoarse, faint but unmistakable, as though she had waited years to speak. "Linda, I didn't disappear. I never left you." I squeezed her hand, holding back tears. "I know, Rosa. Tell me, I'm here." Rosa lowered her head, trembling slightly. Each sentence pulled her back through years locked in darkness. "That night, Mr. Mitchell called me to his house to discuss my writing. I trusted him. I never thought anything bad would happen." She inhaled shakily, her voice cracking. "But he was drunk. He grabbed me, said things that terrified me. I tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go." I placed a hand on her shoulder, staying silent so she could go on. While struggling, I reached for a small statue. I just wanted him to stop. But when I hit him on the head, he fell onto the table. And he didn't get up again. Rosa's voice broke completely. I panicked. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to confess. But when I ran to the door, Mark was there. Hearing Mark's name sent a sharp pain through my chest. He said if I was arrested, you wouldn't survive it, that you loved him, that you'd fall apart if you knew I caused a death. I believed him because I was scared of hurting you. Rosa wiped her tears with the back of her thin hand. Mark said he would help me, that he would take care of everything. I believed him. I bit my lip hard. Every word Rosa spoke scraped against my heart. She continued, "He told me to hide in the attic for a few days until things calmed down. I listened, but a few days became a few months, then years. Every time I said I wanted to turn myself in, Mark threatened that you would die from shock if you knew the truth." She shook her head weakly. "I only wanted to protect you. I didn't realize I was being trapped, with no way out." I swallowed hard. "What about the notebooks, the manuscripts?" Rosa looked at me, her eyes hollow from time. "I wrote to stay sane. I wrote to feel alive. Mark found them. But instead of encouraging me, he took them and said, 'Let me polish these to make them better.'" She paused before continuing. "Then, those stories became his books. I realized he never planned to let me go. He needed me to write, needed me to keep his secret." Her final words came out in a whisper. "He turned me into the ghost of my own sister." I held her tightly. Both of us were trembling. All I could feel was a profound, aching truth. The person I trusted most had imprisoned her for nearly 3 decades. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, I sat beside Rosa in the living room. She looked tired, but her eyes were calmer than I had ever seen them. We had spent the night speaking softly, trying to stitch together the 30 years that had been ripped apart. But I knew it couldn't last. Rosa was the one who spoke first. "Linda, I want to turn myself in." I looked at her. She said it with a firm voice, no trembling, no hesitation. Her calmness tightened my throat. "I've been hiding for 30 years, she said. "Even if Mark forced me, even if I was held captive, I want to end this with my own hands. Will you take me there?" I didn't answer right away. I held her hand for a long time. "I'll go with you," I finally said, my voice shaking but certain. We arrived at the police station near noon. I supported Rosa as we walked in. The officers immediately took notice when I said her name, Rosa Alvarez, the woman who had been missing for nearly 3 decades. They brought us into an office asking about her health before taking her statement. Rosa recounted every detail with a quiet but steady voice. From Mitchell's assault to Mark arriving and taking her back to my house, imprisoning her in the attic. The officers listened intently. A young female officer wrote continuously, glancing up at Rosa with a look of disbelief. Following the statement, an investigative team was dispatched to inspect the attic and the location Rosa had described. I held her hand tightly while we waited. By afternoon, they returned with news that silenced the entire room. Mitchell's remains had been found at Cedar Hill, exactly where Rosa said. There was no doubt Mark had hidden the body. I felt my heart sink. Not relief, not satisfaction, just the crushing weight of truth. That evening, Mark was arrested in front of our house. I wasn't there, but neighbors said he didn't resist. He simply bowed his head, silent, as if he had known this day would come. 2 days later, I prepared clean clothes and some snacks to bring to the detention center for Rosa. I wanted to visit her, tell her to hold on a little longer. But as I was tying a small scarf to the handle of the bag, my phone rang. The officer's voice on the other end was solemn and heavy. "Ms. Linda, we're very sorry. Rosa took her own life last night." The bag fell from my hands. My legs gave way. I had to grab the table to keep from collapsing. They said Rosa left a letter for me. When I went to collect it, the paper trembled slightly because I was holding it too tightly. "Linda, thank you for finding me. I no longer want to live in the shadow of the past." In the cell, I lay down and thought, I am finally free. My final manuscript is in the wooden box under the table. Let it carry the name I wanted, Rosa Alvarez. Thank you for being my only family. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. The pain wrapped itself around me completely, but I knew she chose the ending she believed was liberation, and the only thing left for me to do was to bring her story into the light. After Rosa's simple funeral, I returned to the house that still held traces of her presence in every small corner. I went up to the attic once more, this time without fear or tension. I only wanted to gather the things she left behind, as if keeping the last pieces of her with me. Under the wooden table, with its uneven leg, just as her letter had said, there was a small wooden box. I opened it. Inside was a stack of manuscripts tied with a frayed cloth ribbon. The pages were yellowed, their edges curled by time. I carried the box downstairs to the living room, placed it on the table, and sat for a long while before opening it. Finally, when I was ready, I untied the ribbon and read each page. Rosa's handwriting was still beautiful, soft, alive, though shakier in some places. The manuscript opened with lines that made my eyes sting. I often dream of standing out in the yard under daylight, not through cracks in the door, not through the vent. I just want the light to touch my skin as a reminder that I still exist. I placed my hand on the paper, tears falling onto the edge of her words. Next were passages about her youth, her dream of becoming a writer, the nights we lay in our room whispering about the future. She wrote as if speaking directly to me, gently and honestly, and I had to pause many times just to catch my breath. There was a line where Rosa confided, "I don't blame Linda. She knew nothing." I only hoped that one day she would find me, though I knew that day might never come. I had to close the manuscript because my heart hurt too much, but I kept reading. I wanted to hear every piece of her voice, the voice Mark had stolen for far too long. The manuscript ended with a simple line. If one day this story is told, I hope people will know that even when hidden away, I held on to the belief that truth still has its own light. I couldn't sit still anymore. I wiped my tears, gathered all of Rosa's manuscripts, and went straight to the publishing house that had once worked with Mark. When I handed them the manuscript, they stayed silent for a long time, reading the first pages. Then one of the senior editors looked up, his eyes red. "We want to publish this," he said. "And we'll do it with all the respect Rosa deserves." Everything happened quickly after that. The publishing house held a press conference announcing that Mark's celebrated works had actually been written by Rosa Alvarez, the woman who had been imprisoned for nearly 3 decades. When Rosa Alvarez's book, The Last Light, was released, readers everywhere welcomed it with deep emotion. People sent letters to me, saying they felt as if they could hear the voices of those forgotten, those who never had the chance to step into the light. The book quickly became a symbol, not because of tragedy, but because of the enduring strength of a woman stripped of her freedom, who still wrote, still hoped, still held on to the most beautiful parts of her humanity. Rosa was gone, but through each page she lived again, vivid, warm, and finally heard by the world. And I understood. At last, she was truly free. After Rosa's book was published, life in this house changed completely. There were no more strange noises, no more fear, but the emptiness after her passing made it difficult for me to climb back up to the attic. One morning, with sunlight gently spilling through the windows, I decided to go up once more. This time, not to search for answers, but to do what I knew Rosa would want. I opened the attic hatch. Natural light poured in more brightly now that I had hired someone to fix the small window. The light washed over the room, erasing the shadows of the 28 years she had spent there. The corners that had once been damp and dark I had cleaned thoroughly, replacing them with shelves and a few small plants. The space where Rosa once lived in silence had become a small library. I placed the rest of her manuscripts inside a glass box, arranged neatly beside the books the publisher had reissued under her name. On the wall, I hung a photo from our youth, the two of us standing in a field smiling as if life held nothing but sunlight. I wanted anyone who stepped inside to feel what Rosa should have always had: light, warmth, and a place to belong. Looking back on everything, I came to understand the meaning of the word family more deeply. Family is not just shared blood. Family is where a person is safe, heard, and trusted. Rosa loved me so much that she sacrificed her youth, believing I couldn't bear the truth. And for 30 years, I lived beneath her without knowing she needed me most. The thought tore at me. But it also reminded me that loved ones, especially the quiet, gentle ones, often carry stories we rarely notice. They have memories, fears, and burdens they hide because they want to protect others. With just one question, one closer look, we might have seen what they endured. If I had listened to Rosa sooner, perhaps everything would have been different. But at least, in the end, I brought her voice into the light. Now, every time I step into that small library, I feel Rosa in the smell of old pages, in the soft afternoon glow, in the words she left behind. She lived, she loved, she suffered, and now she is remembered in the way she deserved. Before ending this story, there is one thing I want to ask you, something I've thought about ever since everything happened. If one day a truth in your own family had been hidden too long, would you have the courage to face it, to protect those you love, even if it might change everything? I hope you choose the light, because sometimes, when even one person steps out of the darkness, the entire family can finally be free.